Robot Talk is the podcast that sits down with roboticists from around the world and asks them the questions you always wanted answered. Like, is that robot alive? And how does that thing work? Hello everyone! Welcome to Robot Talk. I'm your host, Claire Asher, and in today's episode, we're exploring the fascinating and mind-boggling field of biohybrid robotics, which blends living and synthetic components to create innovative new robotic systems. But first, don't forget to check out the Robot Talk shop at robottalk.org/shop, where you can get your hands on some awesome Robot Talk merch. Share your love for robotics with the world with one of the Robot Talk t-shirts, stickers, or mugs. So, with all that said, let's get on with this week's interview. I recently had a fun conversation with Maria Guix from the University of Barcelona about combining electronics and biology to create robots that are more than the sum of their parts. This week, I'm chatting to Maria Guix, a senior researcher at the University of Barcelona, working on miniaturised living robots. Hi Maria, lovely to have you on the podcast.
Hi, it's really my pleasure. It's going to be my first and I'm really thrilled to just chat and catch up.
Fantastic. So your research focuses on biohybrid robots. So to get us started, can you explain what that term means and describe the kind of robots that you're working on?
Yeah, so let's start from the beginning, which is biohybrid, which is an entity, which we will talk later how it actually works. But what's important on the biohybrid term is that it has a part which is biologically origin and another part which is synthetic. In this kind of biohybrids, we have a specific selection of robots which are living ones, and these are especially interesting for being made out of living cells, sperms, or it could be some other kind of living entities like spermatozoids.
Okay.
So like bio plus synthetic, and this way you have this hybrid or biohybrid concept.
Mm-hmm. I interviewed one researcher before who was working on this sort of thing, but the biological material was not living. So that living component adds a whole lot of complexity, I guess. And like, how do you keep it alive?
Yeah, this is one of the challenges actually, which the fact of having them alive and being comfortable in a certain hydrogel, this is quite well known because of tissue engineering. So this helped a lot of pushing this field forward. But what makes especially interesting this kind of biohybrid robots, the living ones, is that they have emerging properties. That means that you can train them and the properties that you observe on day 1 are not the same that you're observing in day 10, which is something which is not usually happening with the synthetic ones. And that's what's actually made them living, that you make these living entities, these cells, to evolve as if they were in a living system, in a body, but with a certain properties that you are interested on.
Okay. I mean, that's mind-boggling and fascinating and just incredible that this is even possible, to be honest. Obviously, they're tiny, so this is hard, but what do they look like? Can you help us try and build up a mental picture of the kind of thing we're talking about?
Well, usually, I don't know if it's just because we are working with living cells. What people start doing with the first design was to copy nature. So basically bio-inspired. That doesn't necessarily have to be binded. So living doesn't have to be a design which is copying nature. I will explain that later. But the first one that came to my mind and that you can find in the web anywhere you are searching for biohybrid, it's what they are called, for example, medusoids. And what they resemble, it's obviously a jellyfish, a very tiny jellyfish. So they move like a jellyfish. They are really small, but they are made out of a synthetic thin film nanomembrane where you have like the cells distributed in the same way that they would be in the jellyfish. And then obviously they move like the jellyfish. You have this same example with some fish, like the simple movement of a fish that you can imagine. You have that too. And then we have some others which are just like walkers. So you can imagine two tiny legs which are moving because you have a muscle in the middle which is shrinking them, basically. And all what we have to think, especially the muscle base, is that it relies on contraction and relaxation. That's the motion mechanism that you have to move or like to push for them to move forward.
Okay.
They look like the natural animals, but just tinier. and the size is actually not that small. So we are talking about millimeter scale. From 5 millimeters to 1 centimeter is what we usually call mesoscale.
Mm-hmm. And I guess the other thing that is quite hard to imagine is how you create these robots, how you build them. So can you talk a little bit about these, I think what they're called microfabrication methods?
Yeah, so the microfabrication methods, they are more related to clean rooms. So it's what people generally imagine that scientists do, which is getting like this kind of white robes all over us, not to damage our samples and entering in a very clean space where you have a very limited number of particles. So you are very covered in order not to get your sample dirty. And that allows you to do very tiny structures. So this is going to be the first step of having your living robot. So mostly to fabricate the synthetic part. That's the skeleton of your robot. And then you have to attach the cell somehow. There's different methods. So one method is patterning. Basically, you can put a protein or a molecule that the cells feel comfortable with, or there's a specific binding, and they just attach there. Or you can just make them a squeeze around your structure. So the ones I was telling you that they are walking, it's literally 2 legs. You have the muscle around, and then what the muscle does, it's to contract. So they put a lot of cells of muscle around, they let them just differentiate, and then they get naturally adapted to the body. So many times it's much easier than it seems, because usually the easiest, the better. So we go for simple designs. Biology is hard enough to make as a struggle. So that's the way it works now. Yeah.
So I'm interested by this concept you mentioned of training the cells. And, you know, when you say training, I think a lot of people think of like training their dog. I'm guessing it's not quite like that, but can you kind of talk us through that process?
Yeah. Probably here I will jump to the ones that are actually my specialty, the ones that I've been working for the last 5 years. And in that specific case, I must say that this is not resembling nature. It's one of these few examples where we have living robots, which they don't have bio-inspired shape or bio-inspired design. But we know that design, and that design is a simpler spring. So we have springs in our pants that we can squeeze. And then what happens when you squeeze the spring? It's just bringing back that force, right? It's like it gets out and you push again. So what we did when I was in IBEC, it was to implement this kind of a structure inside the muscles. So basically we have a spring, and around the spring, there's a ring of muscle that continuously contracts. And you can ask me, but how exactly? Well, I can guess that when you are nervous, your eyes sometimes is twinkling. You have these spontaneous contractions in your muscle. In your eyes, it's typically happening, or in your hand. So this muscle, it does the same. It does have these spontaneous contractions. When this happens, it's like if you were bringing this muscle to the gym. So this spring is bringing back this force, back and forth. And then during this differentiation process, which is key for the maturation of the cells, you get this continuous training. So basically, in the living muscle robots, what you need to do is to create this kind of a stretch continuously in their skeleton, which it would be similar to us when we go to the gym. Basically, we are moving our muscles, and that brought them to be stronger. And in here, it happens exactly the same. The magic here is just that they self-stimulate. They don't have to be doing much effort.
I mean, it's quite amazing that these cells respond in that way, even though they are, you know, detached. They're not part of a body. There's no hormones or neurological impulses telling them what to do.
Yeah, I think that here it played a lot engineering. So before coming to Spain or coming back, because I'm actually natural from Barcelona, I was at Purdue University and I was working with other kind of robots. Those were really micro scale. They were like about 50 microns that they have this kind of springs attached as end effector. End effector is nothing else than having a sensor at the end of your robot. So when the robot was moving, we could really know which force it was applying to a certain object. So when I came back, I thought, okay, this could be interesting probably to know the force of the muscle. But I would never expect that the muscle would bring these spontaneous contractions. And I would never expect that because this is actually not observed in nature. Yeah. So this have never been observed before. It was because we were this coupling of a structure that is not in nature with a biological structure that we got these emerging behaviors that you couldn't expect alone. So you wouldn't have that alone with just the spring or with just the muscle itself. It happens when they are together. And this is one of the beauty of these fields, I feel, that you create robots that you cannot really expect how they are going to evolve. And that's very, very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, it must be exciting to see what comes out when you put these different materials together.
Yeah, and I'm really glad because this had been extended by other researchers in MIT and in Carnegie Mellon, and they could make them much smaller and actually integrate the sensors that I was wishing for. So I got this self-stimulation, but I have to say that I didn't got the sensing part. But I'm really glad that others can exploit the technology that we developed in order to go one step further.
Yeah, I mean, science is a big international collaboration of people building on each other's research. So that's good.
Yeah.
So, you've got this biohybrid robot. It has muscles so it can contract, it can move. How do you get it to do what you want it to do?
Well, the magic is in what we call anisotropy. Basically, we go against symmetry. Okay. And this is kind of the same. When you go with simple robots, the simplest I can think of are the Janus particles, which I briefly explained. They are not by far living, but they are a very good example of what anisotropy means, that it's just in a sphere where half of the body you have a material which is catalytic and in the other half, it's not.
Can you define what you mean by catalytic?
Sure. So what happens is that there are certain reactions that they wouldn't occur naturally. And then there is an agent, which is this catalyst, that actually allows this reaction to have enough energy to happen. So basically to have this reaction very intense in one side of your particle, and that makes it to move forward. And they are basically chemical ones. This doesn't really fall onto the living ones. This is in the very, very tiny ones. I'm talking about nanomotors. So they are nanorobots. How we are really translating that in the living robots, which they are scale of a centimeter or hundreds of microns. Well, the one I tell you of 2 legs, one leg is longer than the other, for example. It's much simpler than it seems. It's never that simpler because you have to think on how you do the material, the stiffness of the material is really key. But in terms of design, they are very, very simple. And you achieve this kind of motion because of the asymmetry. And actually, in the one I was telling you that I was doing with this spring, it does have a tiny leg in one edge, which actually bring this anisotropy in the whole system. And this was not by chance. This we intentionally did it. We did some simulations beforehand to know how long this leg has to be according to the material we were doing, and then how we had to 3D print that. And then later on, we actually demonstrated that it worked as simulated, right? But anisotropy is the key. And you see that in all of them.
Okay, that's interesting, yeah.
Although I must say that there's other ways, which are the robots, the living ones. You have 2 ways to make them move, let's say, so especially the muscle ones, right? One are the electrical pulses that you apply. So basically, when you apply an electrical pulse, which it can be every second, in every second, you promote the muscle to contract and relax. And this contraction and relaxation, it's not really happening in a synchronic way. It can be that you have contraction, relaxation. And this also brings a bit this anisotropy that I was telling you. It's not always about the shape. It could be about how it contracts and relaxes, right? And this is one kind, electrical pulses. But what happens if I genetically modify my cells to respond to light. So in that sense, light acts as if it would be a catalyst in the other kind of robots. And you can induce the contraction in a controlled manner in a space and time. And that's very important because you don't have the whole robot contracting at the same time, but rather in a small part of it. And that brings a huge potential and different motion patterns.
That's so interesting. It reminds me of this concept that I learned about from some other roboticists who were talking about morphological computation, where the physical form of the robot responds to the environment or behaves in a certain way without any need for a brain to control it.
Exactly. Well, it's just the way they adapt to nature or that they stimulate. They don't have the central nerves that kind of promote them, but they know how to react to a certain stimuli. And basically, if you do bioengineering, you are able to tune it to the stimuli that you want. In that case, that would be light.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about the advantages of your kind of biohybrid approach versus entirely synthetic materials. Now, I know we've kind of talked around this and probably a lot of them have come up in the conversation already, but is there anything else that you would like to highlight about the advantages of this approach?
I would say that there's many advantages if that gets to be a viable technology, obviously. But the two main advantages are, the first one is that they can self-regenerate, which is something that you don't usually get with the synthetic robots. If you get a cut, the cut remains there and you cannot really do much more.
Yeah.
And the other advantage is this adaptability, which ranges from this concept that I was telling to you about training, getting stronger. So basically you have a system that evolves over time, but it's not only evolving, it's showing novel capabilities that it didn't have at the beginning sometimes. So it's not just enhancing one property, but showing something radically new that you wouldn't be expecting. So these are the two main things. Self-healing is one of the big shots of these living robots. And then we have the adaptability.
This thought just occurred to me as you were talking. Do you have to feed the cells? How do you keep them alive?
Oh, yes, you do. Yes, so this is one of the challenges I feel in the field. You can develop the muscles pretty easily. You can integrate them in a quite, let's say, seamless way. For example, the one of our spring, you get the spring, you squeeze the spring and you put the ring around and there you are. So the mounting is pretty easy. But the part of their survival is always a challenge because you have to keep this continuous feeding that you were mentioning. So they were alive. And it's not only about the feeding, it's about the waste products that are generating during the maturation of the cells. So how people is really thinking about that or in solving this problem, there's really an interesting project. There is an European one called Biomelt that is based on living catheters. In that case, the muscle is supposed to be integrated in a catheter. They are doing so. But an important part of this catheter is not just the actuator per se, which is what helps the finger to bend, let's say, but the bioreactor. So you need to account for a bioreactor that is providing for the necessary nutrients and that it's taking at the same time the waste products generated by the muscle.
Yeah.
So this is one of the things. Another point is that they generally have to be in liquid environments.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
This is another challenge which some researchers address by putting some hydrogels around, like kind of gelatin, and they can last for pretty long. And those same researchers are the ones developing the 3D printing of burgers, by the way.
Okay.
So the fields are very intrinsically attached. So I would say tissue engineering with living robots is very related. But also I have to say that, for example, in our case, the robot that we developed, we found out that the muscle was really strong and really well aligned. And this helped us to use the muscle as a microphysiological platform. So that was not intended to be the case. So we just wanted to use it as a robot. But the muscle was so good that we actually got a company of creams, of face creams for the wrinkles to pay us to check their active product with our muscles. So it was quite nice.
Yeah.
And we got some free samples, which is always good.
Nice. Definitely an unexpected bonus.
Yeah.
So it sounds like this research is still at quite an early stage. What are your long-term goals? What would you like to see these biohybrid robots being used for in, 5-10 years time, or however long you think it might take?
Yeah, well, it depends on the kind of biorobot. I've been explaining mostly the ones I'm working on, which are the muscle ones.
Mm-hmm.
But they're the bionic systems that are basically some animals that you are attaching. It would be like a microchip that is able to control the central nerve of the animal. And by that, I mean like the cockroach or the jellyfish. And those ones are pretty advanced.
I think I've seen these where they've basically hijacked the nervous system of a living cockroach and turned it into a little remote control creature.
Yeah, and actually they're using field. And what I'm saying in field, it's that if there's a catastrophe, like some natural event happening, like a hurricane or something, if you just spread around these cockroaches, you know exactly where they are. They are able to feel the heat because the sensors that are bringing, they know if there's a person nearby. And then they also have this Bluetooth communication that tells you exactly where the cockroach is. So the person you are looking for. So they are really, really useful for this kind of task. I'm not particularly fond of that. I think there's a whole ground of ethical aspects related to that. And I must say that we haven't seen that because in Europe, that's not allowed. So this is basically in Asia. But the ones of the jellyfish, they are used in the States. And they also do the same. And what they do is sea monitoring of certain pollutants. So the jellyfish is happily moving. You can somehow control which area is going, but it has some sensors that it's providing information in real time and it's moving naturally. So those kind of robots are really advanced, but the ones of muscle base, they are not so much. So I would say that we have to wait a good 10 years maybe to see them to be a reality. And the way I expect them to act is basically to help out in some, for example, tissue penetration of drugs or like some, it has to be tissue to tissue. They will never be as tiny as the nanorobots. So we can think of applications such as drug delivery. I don't see that much that they can be useful for environmental purposes because they are very delicate, at least right now. So I don't know if we really work with some good bioreactors, probably in the future, they will be able to cope with all this adaptability in harsh environments, which is not the case. But I really hope to see some. I mean, I'm very positive towards that. And I think that for the prosthetics, it's a huge advance. As I told you, the robot that we developed, we never thought that it would be interesting for drug screening. And it did so. Okay, it's cosmetics, basically because they are the ones interesting to approach you. But for personalized medicine, they open a whole new area to explore because you can do a muscle much more efficiently and it can work. And then if you want to put that muscle to move for some reason or for some kind of, I think it will be drug delivery, it will be there. But we need them to be smaller and more autonomous.
Coming back to the cockroach example that you mentioned, I share your I'm slightly creeped out by that whole concept. And yeah, I think ethically it's a bit dubious. Often people don't seem to have a problem with things like that when they're done to insects, but I kind of empathize with the insects.
I do too. And this is one of the things that I love about the research I'm doing now, that I don't feel this pity or this ethics on me, because I'm working with immortalized cells. So they just keep growing and growing and growing. I'm not killing any animals. So I'm just generating the muscle myself. And at the time that we were doing that kind of test with human cells, they were also given of patients and they were not harmful. So they were like from some operations. So there's really ways to do it in a way that you are not interfering on the decisions of a living animal. I think that's the difference between a living robot itself that you develop from scratch. It would be a bit of the bottom-up or top-down approach, right? It's really like that. But I fully agree. But the community is very conscious about that, or at least is starting to be. There's like some reviews regarding the ethics associated to these biohybrid robots. And it's from several aspects because it all comes from the legislation to the ethics. So not to be late on the legislation to prevent that some, I'm sorry for the term, but crazy stuff is done with the animals. There's some others, for example, that they are very interesting, honestly, but also it feels weird. You know, the moths, the butterfly moths?
I haven't seen this one.
So they are butterflies that they have like big antennas, like huge antennas. And what they do is that they just take the antennas, which has a lot of sensors itself, and they attach it to drones.
Wow.
And the drones get a lot of capabilities instantly because they get this sensing on the space, on the chemicals around, the same thing that the animal is getting. They just extract that to the animal and they put it in the robot. It's also, I think that there's some limits there. Okay, they say, okay, fine, if these animals, they grow a lot, you have many of them. It's true, but at the end, it's an animal which has like some free will and you are just extracting a part of it. So I'm really prone on the kind of robots which you generate from scratch. So you basically grow the cells, you get to understand how the cells developed and how you create a specific skeleton for them to act as you wish. So you basically create, I wouldn't say create life because that wouldn't be, that's not the truth. And this is something I want to say when we did that work and it was a big hit in science robotics. My friends used to call me the mother of Robocop. And I was like, no. Because by any means, our living robots are not able to reproduce. So they are exploiting the capabilities of the living cells, but they are not able to replicate. And I think it's something positive because we have control over them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So we just exploit that to get them stronger, to be more adaptable, or for drug delivery to act better if they have to act in that area or to be, working in the body. But at the end, I think we have to be respectful in ethical terms. And as I tell you, the community is getting into that and talking with philosophers, with other people, which is working with hard ethics and also in all the legislation standpoint, which is very important, what it can be done and what it shouldn't be done, right?
Yeah, I'm glad that that's being discussed early on. The antenna from the butterfly example, that just seems like lazy robotics. It's like if you want to be a bio-inspired roboticist, you should try and actually figure out how the antenna works and make it out of our own materials. That's just lazy.
What you are describing actually is something which is very often done in robotics, which is reverse engineering, it's called. And we are kind of doing the same in another way. So if we are able to create muscle from cells from scratch by training them, we are able to understand actually somehow how the cells are being developed in our bodies. Because if I achieve that muscle, it means I start to elucidate which are the mechanisms throughout which cell it's getting mature, right? So many scientists do the other application of this reverse engineering, which is like, okay, I do have this antenna which is working. So I'm checking which are the nanostructures that it has this antenna, which is the part that actually is able to sense how the nerves are organized. Literally understanding how is the morphology and the nerves and the neurons and whatever, it has this antenna, this natural one. And then they mimic it. And this is very important because we really do so. We copy nature. This is this bio-inspired. We mimic that in this synthetic or biohybrid because sometimes you want to include this living, let's say, half evolved system, which is the cell, the sperm, the bacteria, and not much more. Like the living ones just stands by those. But it's complicated sometimes. Like
yeah, definitely.
Especially like, I think one really struggled me was one that and it's very efficient, but they just take the muscle from the frog, which is very sensitive. And then they put it in a robot, in a leg of a robot, and they just actuate it. Like they just apply an electrical pulse and the robot, I think it's the one able to jump. The most efficient robot compares size to the, but actually you are taking the whole part of the living animal and put it in the robot. So I think that the whole community is trying to really understand better and not go so much on that, but rather creating from these natural designs.
Yeah, I think that's the better approach. It also means you learn more about the natural world, which I always think is a good thing.
And we learn a lot. Many surprises on the way, though.
Yeah. Maria, it's been fascinating speaking to you today. I've been talking to Maria Guix from the University of Barcelona. Thank you.
A lot, Claire.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoy Robot Talk, please share the podcast, subscribe, and leave a review. And if you've got a question you'd like me to ask one of my future guests, you can contact me on social media at Robot Talk Pod, on Patreon at patreon.com/Claire Asher, or at robottalk.org. I regularly announce upcoming guests on all those platforms, and I'd love to include your questions in my next interview. Next week, I'm speaking to Alan Winfield from the University of the West of England about ethical robot behaviour. Until then, I've been Claire Asher, and this has been Robot Talk. Robot Talk Season 6 is sponsored by the Hamlin Centre, Imperial College London.